away from the great school on the East Coast, but Geoff, congratulations for the latest upgrade.
Well, thanks, Ronnie. It's really lovely of you to say that, but I know everyone wants to hear from you and not about me. So the meetings in Beijing, 6% growth rate, more focus on indigenous technology. Are those the right takeaways? What's your read of what's happened in Beijing this week?
First of all, there are not many countries that are truly continental economies. When they're that big, such as the United States or China, they tend to be internally oriented. That means domestic matters are far more important than international matters. And so China's emphasis has always been for the last 40 years for the last many more years, have always been domestically oriented. It is only to the extent that you have to deal with the rest of the world, because the world is now a connected one, that China has to take care of the rest. So if left alone, China's main emphasis will be to take care of domestic affairs, in particular to grow its economy. So the 6% one, I think it's a good issue to pick on. On technology, I think America is really helping China. I don't know why. I mean, to me, it's crazy. But America is really forcing China to develop its economy. The United States is saying, I cannot supply you this, I cannot supply you that anymore. So the Chinese, what do? There's nothing they can do except to develop themselves. Don't forget that they are today more engineers trained every year by China than the top few countries add together in the world. And they do have a lot of money in the system. So with technology, with money, with human resources, I think America is forcing and helping China to develop its technology. I just don't see how it's good for the United States per se, but people do foolish things in the national arena, and America is doing exactly that today.
So we'll get to your advice for the Biden administration a little later, but you said that China is focused domestically and has always been focused domestically. But people in the West are picking up this notion that President Xi Jinping has used now, called the dual circulation economy, which really talks about this pivot away from export-led growth to domestic consumption-led growth. Is that a big change, or is it a natural change? Is it a function of geopolitics? Was China always going to be increasingly concerned with the domestic market, or is it a product of the geopolitical tensions, above all with the US in the last several years?
Of course, all of the above, Geoff. You're a great international political economist, so you know that more than any of us. As is the developmental model of any country anywhere in the world, in particular in Asia after World War II, you begin by exporting your way out of poverty. Japan, it took place in the 50s and 60s. The four dragons in the 80s and 70s and 80s, in China in the 90s and 2000s. So export is always the thing to do in order to get yourself out of poverty if you can. And so many of the Asian countries did, and so did China. The only thing is that China is a lot bigger. If you were to look at the trade deficit the United States had with China over the last 20 years, all it did was it shifted from the four dragons and some Japan to being Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. It shifted to mainland China. That's all. So from the United States perspective, if you don't look at the origin, then then the trade deficit is exactly the same. So once China got on that path, it really catapulted China's economy. But then up to a certain point, whether it is domestically generated, such as domestic consumption being up, or international reasons, as you alluded to, that is the United States or somebody else from the outside saying, let's curb Chinese export. Both are happening. And so as a result, China has no choice. And it's a very natural progression, just like what you see in Japan, just like what you see in Korea. The domestic market begin to grow, and hence you have this dual circulation, as you said, that is to emphasize the domestic market more It is not a strategy. It is something that you just have to do. You have no choice. If you'd hit me from this side, Geoff, I would have to block it. It's a natural reaction, right? So whatever is this dual circulation, it's just responding to reality. That's all.
Okay, so let's focus in on last year, on 2020. China got into the coronavirus first. It got out of the coronavirus, one of the first countries, along with a few others in East Asia, and had the best growth performance of any economy in 2020. If you were to give a sort of explanation or a grade for how China managed coronavirus, what would it be?
Well, it is a combination of two things. A lot of Americans, because of politics, do not want to face reality. They say that the form of government doesn't matter. That is to lie. That is to say in my face and say Ronnie Chen is handsome. It is a lie. That is to say Geoff Garrett is ugly. No, Geoff Garrett is handsome. Okay, face facts. The forms of government matters a lot. The quality of government, of course, also matters. And that's what the West say. And so everybody, 99.999% of the people don't think. They just repeat whatever they hear. And so when they say form of government doesn't matter, it's a quality that matters. No, both matters. I'm not saying making a value judgment on who is better, who is worse. It is just a form of government that is a reflection of history and a reflection of culture. And China for the last 4,000, 5,000 years has been a unitary state. And so what it is, what's the difference? It's the same thing today. My son, who is also a USC graduate, he went to Shanghai with his dear wife about a month or so ago. And then he was telling me about the seamlessness of the society. And another friend was just telling me this yesterday. If you fly into Shanghai, but you have to go to Suzhou, every step of the way is totally managed. And as a result, they are able to trace everybody and hence better contain the virus. Nobody else can do, very few people can do that in the world, and let alone a big country like China. But China can do it because of the form of government. You like it, you don't like it, doesn't matter. It does have a lot less death in the whole country. Today, I don't know, something like, even with Wuhan at the beginning, they only have something like, if I remember correctly, 50,000 deaths. Whereas in the United States, how many millions of them have died? Yeah. Right? Or maybe 500,000 or whatever.
Close to 500,000, I think, yes.
500,000, yeah. So I think that the form of government really matters. I cannot be Geoff Garrett. Geoff Garrett cannot be Ronnie Chen. You cannot, learn something because of the history and culture that you come from. So I'm not making a value judgment who is better, who is worse. It is just that their system make them able to contain the virus a lot better than any other country. And together, if you have their form of government, but a bad government, quality-wise bad, it doesn't work either. But they happen to have both a right form for this purpose and a good leadership. And as a result, they contain virus very well. And that's why my business is thriving in the mainland, because everybody is back to normal. And they only had about 2.5 months of really bad time last year in February to mid-April.
So you've talked about the benefits of a unitary state. Some people worry now that the private sector in China is being squeezed out by government action. Chinese entrepreneurs have been worried about this for years, as you know. But we had the headline case late last year in which the Ant Financial IPO was blocked by Beijing. I think that's the fair description of it, even though the IPO was going to be in Hong Kong. What do you take from that? I mean, Jack Ma had done enormous financial innovation that lots of Chinese people had benefited from. This electronic money market fund, ease of mobile payments, etc. And Ant was ready to be the biggest IPO of all time, and then it just got stopped. should we be concerned about that?
Well, first of all, people have been saying in China that the private sector is being curbed. China's private sector has been curbed. It has been saying that for how long? A long, 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 long time. And yet the reality is the economy is extraordinarily vibrant. And it is not mainly because of the public sector. It's mainly because of the private sector companies. And so you say it, and business people love to complain. We all know that. And so you keep saying it. The reality is the private sector is doing extraordinarily well. Yesterday, a young man came to me. I've known him since he was a 4-year-old. Now he's 38. And he has been living for the last 7 years in Beijing. He was from Columbia University, another great university. And he was telling me that the vibrancy of the economy of the high-tech business in Beijing is just amazing. And so the private sector, is it being curbed? Well, keep talking about it. The reality is a reality. And, if you keep talking about it and get yourself into an ideological mindset and think that that is the end of the Chinese economy, then you don't deserve to make money there. That's all. And financing is a different story, just a side story. That very day that it was supposed to be, the next day that it was supposed to be listed, the vice chair of Alibaba was supposed to have lunch at my office. I got a phone call that morning at 12 noon and said, "I'm sorry, Joe cannot come." And I didn't know what's going on. If he cannot come, he cannot come. That night at 8 o'clock, Ant Financial IPO was pulled. Well, frankly, I don't know how the Chinese really boo-boo. They really make a crazy mistake. How did they allow Ant Financial to get to that point of ready to go IPO the next day? The reality is, it is an unregulated financial service sector that somehow the mainland Chinese government officials just turn a blind eye to or somehow neglected. If they had went public, it would be horrific for China's financial future. It is unregulated, and it's just crazy. It's like some of the banking system in America is totally unregulated. So I think China is lucky and last minute smart. They were pretty dumb before that. Last minute smart to pull it in order to preserve the long-term health of the economy, of the financial market in the mainland of China. There's a lot of detail. I won't go into it.
So last question about the mainland before we move on to Hong Kong. You mentioned that your business is going gangbusters. Congratulations. But there are always concerns with respect to China that there's going to be an end to the infrastructure boom and real estate has got to be a bubble. How do you think about that? China's built the best infrastructure in the world, but there've got to be some limits to that. And by God, there's been a lot of real estate developed. Are there going to be limits to that? Are you worried about bubbles?
Well, every country in the world has bubbles. It's just a matter of how they are created and how you deal with it, right? In the West, in particular in America, the market is very free, and hence bubble form and without people even knowing about it. So in 2008, suddenly it blew up on our face. China has their problems that bubble do form, but usually the bubble is formed because of deliberate policy on the part of the government. So if the government is vigilant, they usually can catch it. But my fear, of course, is that one of these days they are not as vigilant, or they make a mistake, which is very possible, and then things will blow up. So bubbles are created differently, and they are dealt with differently. Real estate, for example, you mentioned, was such a big part of the Chinese economy because people were living in a very inadequate way. And so, they had to develop the real estate sector, in particular residential sector, and they have to meet the housing need. And then it also happened to stimulate the economy. But then the Chinese leaders know that there are limits to that because it can form a bubble, and then people get overboard. All those things can happen. And so you look at the history of the last 30 years, the Chinese leadership so far have been able to recognize problems ahead. So before the bubble get out of hand, they control it, such as by limiting the mortgages or limiting people's ability to buy. A lot of measures that cannot be used in the West can be used in the mainland of China, such as you cannot buy more than one unit. And so with policy, they can control that bubble better. That said, I always worry about one or two things. Number one, they did not recognize a problem. Number two, their medicine is a wrong one that can exacerbate the problem, in which case you really can have a terrible situation. That's my worry for China. On the other hand, for America, the market is so free that 2008 can develop, and it suddenly confronted us at the United States economy and the world economy as a result was at the brink of collapse. And I think that the West is in danger as well. So let's not, always say that you are bad. Geoff, you're ugly. Geoff, you're ugly. Geoff, you're ugly. Just like Geoff, you should not say Ronnie ugly, Ronnie ugly, although I am. But whatever it is, it's just a different system. And who is to say that you alone have the right system? Whoever says that is a very, very proud person. As Dr. Henry Kissinger often say, Henry always say that for 3,000, 5,000 years, and your fellow Duke University alumni last night in a program debate with me, David Rubenstein of Carlyle Group, said exactly the same thing. That for 3,000 years, China was at the height of global economy and culture. And they did it in the same way that they're doing it today. And it is not self-evident, to use Henry's word, that they have to do it another way, such as the Western way, in order to succeed. So if we were to say that you cannot succeed, you cannot succeed, you cannot succeed, be careful. What if the guy succeeds? And it has been like that for the last 40 years. And some of my Western friends are still saying, China cannot succeed, China cannot succeed, China will fail. They have been growing for 40 years. One of these days they will fall, no question about it. Just like in the West, 2008 will happen again. So does it mean that 2008 happened, then America fall? No, America is doing okay. But America have to be careful, just like the Chinese have to be careful for different reasons, because the bubbles are formed differently and they are being dealt with differently. There are some basic fundamental economic issues that are the same. And so the measures, some of them in principle are exactly the same. For example, you cannot, have QE10 and still expect no inflation eventually. I think that China is as sinful, guilty in this matter as the United States in doing QE3, QE5, QE10. And both of them have to face the music one day, just that they do it in a slightly different way. Let's not say, Geoff, you're ugly. And so please, I won't say that. So please do not also say.
So I think we should, let's move on to Hong Kong. So I guess the news out of the Beijing meetings this week will be a new electoral law for Hong Kong, following the new national security law from last year. And of course, that's received lots of negative publicity, and also criticisms from the British and American governments, among others. But the other side in Hong Kong in 2020 is that it looked like a remarkably successful economic year. The Hong Kong market was up, the RMB is stronger. What's your view on Hong Kong in 2021 versus Hong Kong 2019? Some pre-post on the new Hong Kong.
Geoff, I'm never good in figuring out the short term. If I get the longer term right, I'll be okay in business. So what happened in 2021? Well, I can say a few things, but anyway, it's neither here nor there. As far as Hong Kong is concerned, you mentioned about the election. Do you know who gave Hong Kong democracy?
Is that a rhetorical question? The British
did not. The British did not. The governor in the old days was never elected. In fact, it was just shoved down our throat. As long as they're here, they did not give us election. They gave some semblance in the last 10, 15 years. Total hypocrisy. So today, when I hear the British talk about Hong Kong political development, I said, how hypocritical can you be? You never did it for 150 years. And China was the one that gave us democracy, and now you're criticizing. Why didn't you give it to us earlier? So the hypocrisy is just deafening. America is just, simple-minded people. They know their system, and they think their system is the best in the world, so everybody has to have their system. I always remind people of one thing. You remember what happened in January 6th in Capitol Hill? A group of people took over one building in America, right? And it was quickly put down. It was terrible. What happened in 2019 in Hong Kong was far more violent. It lasted 7 months. And in America, just in one day, a few people were killed. In Hong Kong, there was not one single case over 7 months when people die because of the police violence. Police are human beings. They react. But on the other hand, compared to Minneapolis, Washington, D.C., the Hong Kong police was extraordinarily restrained. Extraordinarily. Just come and look at the footages of all the that was taken at that time. And so when people say, Hong Kong has police brutality, compare the United States, it's me compared to Geoff. Geoff is tall, I am short. Okay? What is the chance of me beating Geoff? So, if you want to know about Hong Kong, the first thing is get out of your prejudice. Read US newspaper, read Western newspaper, and you will not understand Hong Kong because you're total ideological and politics blinds. There was Fortune article in February 8th, Fortune magazine in February 8th by an old gentleman, 80-some-year-old by the name of Alan Smith. He was a former chairman of Giant Fleming's. That was the only fair piece. He has been living in Hong Kong for 50-some years. Read that piece roughly February 10th or 8th, Fortune magazine in Hong Kong. That is the only one that is fair, that is a fair reflection of the facts.
So I've heard many of my friends in Hong Kong talk about just life on the streets having returned to normal, and that people are very thankful for that. But I was, since this is a largely a business audience, I wanted to ask you about whether the compatibility, you talked about the long-term compatibility between more Beijing political control of Hong Kong with Hong Kong's traditional market-oriented economy. Can these two things coexist in the medium term?
How about mainland China? It's been growing for the last 40 years. Could it coexist?
But people, as you know, people go to Hong Kong because of the Western rule of law. And Beijing, I think, has benefited from having an offshore RMB market in Hong Kong. Is the economic special status of Hong Kong compromised by the political changes?
The economy is not compromised by the political change. The economy is already destroyed by those people who caused the trouble, the riots in 2019. We don't need the electoral change today from Beijing to destroy Hong Kong. It's already destroyed. The opposition in the last 20-some years have already destroyed the economy of Hong Kong. Think about this. 50 million plus mainland Chinese tourists come to Hong Kong and spend tons of money here. And it was estimated that 30% of our private consumption is from tourists from the mainland of China. Out of that 30%, maybe 80%, 90% of them are gone. So let's just be generous and say only 20% of total personal consumption is now gone because of the riot. And will they come back? I don't know. I will be rather doubtful. It will not be like before, I don't think. And so, when you have 25% of the private consumption totally gone overnight just because of the riot, that is worse than January 6th in Capitol Hill. Do you think that our economy will be strong? It was destroyed by the rioters. It doesn't need the election change from Beijing. In fact, the election change in Beijing is to ensure the peaceful future of Hong Kong, without which we're entering into anarchy. I saw riots on the street in 1966, 67, when I was a high school kid. I've never seen anything like that until 2019. You have that total 7 months. It was only stopped by COVID. So if that had continued, Hong Kong's economy is gone, even without COVID. And well, even if the riot were to stop for whatever reason, it already inflicted a rather traumatic damage to the economy of Hong Kong. But that said, if Beijing were to help Hong Kong, and that would depend on Hong Kong people, whether Hong Kong people will still become a pain on the side of Beijing, such as independence. Let me give you one case, Geoff. This is an interesting one. What if the people who stormed the Capitol Hill on January 6th, a couple of days or weeks later, they went to Russia, they went to the Duma, they went to Putin and said, please send a Marine, if they have one, send a Marine to Rhode Island, land there to liberate us and declare independence of Rhode Island with the help of the Russians. What happened to those few guys, Americans, when they return to JFK, when they fly back? They'll be taken away just like that. And that is exactly the case of what happened with the opposition in Hong Kong. They went to Mike Pence, they went to Pompeo and said, please send a Marine to Hong Kong, deliver us, we want Hong Kong independence. So you think that, it's not an economic issue. Unfortunately, this is a political issue that was domestically generated, but it was certainly helped by the outside world. And so should those guys be locked up? Well, you tell me. If the guy from Capitol Hill on January 6th were to go to Putin and say, to Duma, please come and save us in Rhode Island, we want independence. What will happen to those guys when they fly back to JFK? That's exactly what happened, just the opposite direction. So if those guys were to be arrested, what about those guys in Hong Kong today?
Okay,
Do you not need the national security law because of that? There's no national security law in Hong Kong before that. It was whatever left over by the British, which is draconian, by the way. It was just not exercised. So there's no security law in Hong Kong. Is there a part of the United States or any other country where parts of the country has no national security law? That was Hong Kong. So what's wrong with instituting NSL, national security law? Is it Beijing's idea to do it? They don't want to do it. If they had wanted to do it, they could have done it anytime in the last 24 years. And they were forced to do it because anarchy was happening in Hong Kong. And so they have no choice. Of course, the fact that they forced themselves into a corner that they have to do that says that Beijing has totally lost this game. They were dumb for 23 years. They forced themselves into this corner. And there's nobody wins. And so be it.
Okay, so I'm going to go to my last question. I had some other things I was going to ask you, but I'll end with your advice for the Biden administration. And the wry joke in US-China watchers at the moment is there's no bipartisanship in Washington except where China is concerned. And both sides of the aisle are anti-China. So the Biden's National Security Team, Secretary of State and head of the NSC are meeting the Chinese foreign minister in Alaska, not in Hawaii, after a trip to East Asia this weekend. How would you advise the Biden administration to make its initial entreaties to the Chinese government?
Same thing. I know what they're going to say. I can write the script for you beforehand. And I know what the Chinese will say also. It means nothing. It's not going to change a damn thing. And so, it's very sad. America is just, it's a typical Thucydides trap that America has chosen to fall under. The last time mankind has ever seen the Thucydides trap in that size was perhaps 200 some years ago when the United States rose and Britain, had to cede North America. But then, of course, in those days, Britain has their interest in India. So they would say, okay, fine, we'll lose in North America. We'll go to India. That's the crown jewel anyway. That was the last time. So today we're seeing the Thucydides trap in front of our face. And it is all politics. And so whatever Biden says means nothing. The US-China relationship will go on. China is very conciliatory. Just read what was said. And China is reactionary as well, in the sense that they are not initiating that much. They're just reacting to whatever America did. That was the case under Trump, and that's the case under Biden. So, everybody has to appeal to their own constituents. So do the Chinese. And so Biden will say what they want their people to hear. China will say what they want the Chinese people will hear. And nothing will happen in Alaska unless the Thucydides trap is reversed. And by definition, the Thucydides trap says that the number one country will prevent the number two from rising because, it's the existing interest, number one. And so, look at our old friend, I think you know him, Paul Wolfowitz, 1992, the Wolfowitz Doctrine. That's what started the modern neocons. And that has been playing out in front of our eyes. That's all. And basically what his paper says in 92 was that America will not allow any number two to rise, whoever they are, China, Russia, doesn't matter. And we will take, if necessary, unilateral action and preemptive action. And that, at the time, Ted Kennedy and others strongly denounced it as American imperialism. Well, the fact is, over the last 30 years, that has gradually taken on to become center stage through Bush 2 and then later Trump. Now, obviously, what happened in China is that China has been rising. And China rising just scared the heck out of Washington, D.C. So they say, okay, fine, let's go to the Thucydides trap and let's fall into it together. That's all. Be very objective about it. And that's exactly what happened.
Fantastic. So let's now move, Ronnie, to the questions, both the questions that came in when people registered and the ones that have come in during your session. A couple of very interesting ones that have just come in. One person, Ari, notices that there was a lot of stuff about environmental standards and carbon neutral projections for China in the new 5-year plan or the 2035 plan. So two-part question, how serious is China about climate change? And is this an area of potential collaboration between the US and China in the next few years?
First of all, I can make a case easily that Beijing is far more conscientious of the environment than most of the American administration in the recent decade or two. Certainly way above the Trump. And so with Biden now in the White House, I think there's great opportunities for the two sides to collaborate. A lot of people who have never been to China, never care to study China, and just read the newspaper, and that's where they're totally misled. And so they come up with all kinds of crazy ideas, such as, sorry to say, Geoff, your question, is China serious about the environment? They are far more serious in the last 20 years, at least 15, than the United States in general. And they know that they cannot borrow from the future generation just for today's growth. They had to do a lot of things at the beginning just to get out of poverty. So they corrupted the environment, just like the United States did, just like, look at a picture of 1952 London. Yeah. It was unbearable because of the necessity to rebuild the economy after the war. And so China went through that. But China, they're not that dumb. The last thing you want to do is think that your counterparty is dumb. That's a great way to lose a game, right? So, the Chinese have been serious about environmental protection far more than, I won't say more than the Europeans, but certainly far more than the United States. So I think that with Biden administration, there's plenty of room for collaboration. I do, as you know, 5-star luxury shopping centers and offices all over China. The regulation over there for the environment is far more stringent than any other market I've ever operated in.
Okay, Matthew Ross asks you a question about the RMB and the dollar. And the question is, could the RMB replace the dollar as the world's reserve currency? And if so, how would that happen? He's not alone, of course, in wondering about that. People like Ray Dalio from Bridgewater are now worried about the status of the dollar. What's your take on that? You've already alluded, I think, to the fact, to the debt and inflation pressures in the US and endless monetary easing. What do you see in the world financial system? Is the dollar in jeopardy?
About 15 years ago, I hosted a program at the Asian Society Hong Kong, and our guest was Robert Mundell, the Nobel laureate and so-called the father of Europe. The last question I asked him was, tell us, Professor Mundell, uh, when will the US dollar become no longer the number one international exchange currency? And his answer was 100 years. My answer today is still the same, except that there's only one country that can, not one currency, but one country that can replace the US dollar, and that is the United States. My worry, like Ray Dalio, is the United States have, if they keep moving in the wrong direction, such as under Trump in many ways, protectionism and so forth, I fear that the United States dollar, people may lose confidence in it. The RMB does not want to replace the US dollar, neither can they. The RMB, frankly, I don't advise them to free up the RMB in the capital account basis. So it's not even totally free flowing. And they should not, in my opinion, open their currency in the capital account basis. So how can you replace the US dollars? But I do worry about the US dollar itself. By another 2008, for example, if it coincided with another geopolitical incident, for example, and and if America keep moving in the wrong direction, such as in the international arena, such as in the last 4 years, then I think that the chances of the rest of the world losing confidence in the United States dollar is good. It's up to the United States. If they don't do foolish things, I think the US dollar will be, I agree with Robert Mundell, for the next 100 years, it will still be the only reserve currency. But I do worry about the US dollar.
So like a couple of questions have come in about Hong Kong versus Shenzhen, Hong Kong versus Shanghai. I was going to ask you about the so-called Greater Bay Area Initiative, the melding Guangdong province with Hong Kong. Is into this Greater Bay Area economy, the richest part of China, more than 100 million people. Is that idea a positive for Hong Kong or a negative?
Well, let's put it this way. Some people are stuck in history. They're frozen in time. They still think that Hong Kong is so special, so important, and so forth. Well, Hong Kong is important. Hong Kong is significant. But don't forget, mainland China has been growing like hell. Shenzhen's high tech is one of the most vibrant in the world. And so, and then on the other hand, Hong Kong, because of the rioters of 2019, has destroyed its own economy. So the future of Hong Kong is what? The future of Hong Kong is, well, Hong Kong is 95% of our economy is service industry. We service somebody. In the 50s, 60s, we service the United States. 60s, 70s, we service Europe. And the 70s, 80s, we service Japan and so forth. In the last 20, 30 years, who do we service? Mainland China. So as a service industry, we have no choice but to go with whoever has the money. And today, who has the money? Shenzhen has the money. Greater Bay Area has the money. So your mindset better change. Don't be frozen in time. If you are frozen in time, you do not deserve to survive. So today, Hong Kong's economy, because of the reason I mentioned, has no choice but to rely on the mainland of China. And the Greater Bay Area will grow and develop. You just watch it. And so somebody asked, another American saying, which is amazing and wonderful, why do you rob a bank? Well, that's where the money is. Why do you work with Greater Bay Area? Because that's where the money is. Hong Kong needs the technology. Hong Kong needs a vibrant economy, and there's one right north. You can drive there in 1.5 hours. If you don't do that, you're dumb. By the way, don't stop destroying our own economy by our own Hong Kong people. And so, we can still play a role in that, in a very useful role, in particular in the financial market area, financial service area, and we should be able to serve them. But to have this bifurcation, we and them, is a dumb one. Does the rise of Chicago take away from New York? If it does, then New York should continue to grow rather than say, why are you taking business away from us, right? The commodity markets went to Chicago to some extent. And if New York were to gripe about it, New York would be nothing. But thank God, New York keep moving on. Now it's a tech center besides just a financial center, thanks to Bloomberg and so forth. So I think that this concept of bifurcation of you and me is a very dumb one. Today is a connected world, in particular Hong Kong, now part of China politically and economically, so close to it. If we don't take advantage of the Greater Bay Area, we're dumb.
Okay, next.
And we underestimate the foolishness of anybody, including ourselves.
So one question that just came in after your comments on the RMB versus the dollar was asking you a question about the digital RMB, and China seems to have real interest in an official digital currency versus a Bitcoin style crypto. What's your expectation about the emergence of a digital yuan?
Well, first of all, I'm not an expert on that. I personally just not too interested in that stuff, but I recognize it's very important. If the RMB is not going to be totally open and be an exchange currency, which I don't think they should, nor do they have the intention to. But being the second largest trade, or number one and number two largest trade country in the world, and increasingly investment will follow. So when you are that international, like China is today, arguably China is one of the most international countries in the world today. So when that is the case, you have if the currency is being held up by somebody else, the United States can anytime turn off the tap. You have no choice but to find ways to protect yourself. And I suspect that the digital RMB, whatever you call it, is just one way of trying to bypass that. The United States, on the other hand, which was never really interested in that stuff, I think, but recently they realized, hey, if the Chinese are going to do that, we better do as well. And so that will become yet another battlefield, between the two countries, which to me is very sad. I wish they would work together. I think the world can only be a peaceful place when the United States and China work together. Some of the things America is doing is crazy. Like calling China the communist China, communist China, communist China. And then a lot of your students begin to ask questions about the communist China. What does that tell me? That tells me that those guys are not thinking independently. They're just reacting to what Trump says. Now, not everything that Trump says is wrong. Some of the things he says I like very much. But some of the areas are plain, politically driven, and that's all. Like calling China communist. Yesterday, a young man from Colombia, as I mentioned to you, came to my house for 3 hours. And he was telling me, after living for 7 years in Beijing, for the first time, by the way, in his life and in business, he was telling me how that China is today the most capitalistic country he has ever known. So, if you want to know about China, you have to know about these things. So then, when Americans don't think, don't study, don't go there, don't analyze, and just follow Trump and say, communist China, communist China, communist China, you are mistaken. You're fooling yourself. And you do not deserve to make a lot of money if that is the case. And the world will not be a better place just because you're ideologically blind and don't see that China is the most capitalistic big country in the world today, bar none.
Well, certainly, I love going out on the street in Shanghai or Beijing, and the sort of street level entrepreneurs, the density of them is higher than in Manhattan at its peak. I mean, that's absolutely true. A question that came in from when somebody registered, I thought was really interesting about the future of American brands in China, given geopolitical tensions. So Starbucks, Apple, Tesla, Yum Brands. How do you think the American brands and American companies operating in China, how well are they going to do in the next few years? Or are they going to be adversely affected by the geopolitical stuff?
Well, first of all, if you were to look at the last 30 years, American brands is very successful in the mainland of China. GM almost died everywhere else in the world. The biggest market probably next to the United States is the Chinese market.
It's bigger. The Chinese market is bigger for GM, or it was in 2018, than in the US.
There you go. A friend of mine started McDonald's restaurants in China about what, 30 some years ago, and is so successful today. And Yum brand as well as Kentucky Fried Chicken, right? So, many brands in China have done extraordinarily well. I think China will continue to be very amicable to American brands as long as you don't get involved in, accusing Chinese of this and that, For example, like Starbucks, Xi Jinping wrote a letter to the chairman of Starbucks, didn't he? Just recently, right? Very friendly, and say, we welcome you to come in here and continue to do business. And China there were two men fighting. One is called United States under Trump, the other is called Beijing under Xi Jinping. And there's only one adult on the stage at that time. And China was far more cool-headed and calculating and think the long term and welcome American brands. But on the other hand, if America were to be crazily, indiscriminately, pick on the Chinese brands such as TikTok, Huawei at least has a national security aspect to it. TikTok, what about, all the software companies in America that control the world, including China in many ways? So, when you begin to do foolish things, then the Chinese have no choice but to react. So that question should not be asked to Beijing. That question should be asked to Washington, D.C. The answer rests with the United States.
Okay, we've got, I think, time for a couple more questions. First one is a question about Hong Kong and access to capital and changes in the business environment in the last year. Easier or harder to raise capital in Hong Kong? Opportunities for Western financial services firms in Hong Kong? What's your view of that world, financial services in Hong Kong going forward?
Nothing changed in the last 2 years since the riot happened. As easy as ever to access capital. In the old days, it's mostly Western capital flowing into mainland China. In the coming decade or two, if not longer, it will be both direction. It will flow out of mainland China into the rest of the world as well. And Hong Kong will benefit as the international financial center. So I think that, the access to capital is never an issue in Hong Kong. In fact, it is a lot better today than before because of an alternative source, which can be extraordinarily big as well.
A couple of questions about Chinese protections for intellectual property. My feeling has always been the more intellectual property China had to protect, the greater intellectual property protections would become. Is that the trajectory? I mean, there's so much, I think it was the case that there were more patents issued in Shenzhen than in Silicon Valley. What's the future of intellectual property protection on the mainland?
Well, first of all, let's look at the history. Every developing economy have a problem with IP rights, intellectual property rights, protection rights. For example, where did the textile business in the United States, where did it come from?
Came from the UK.
Right. And it's stolen. A guy was smuggled from the UK to America, and that's how the textile business in America started. So IP, everywhere in the world. And I remember, the British got a lot from the German as well, right? So, everybody steals from everybody. And such is the economic reality. It's not that we condone it, but I'm just telling you historic facts. And so once the country, as you alluded to, Geoff, has enough IP of their own rights, they will begin to protect it. And that's exactly what's happening in mainland China. Americans don't like to read history. And so they think that only China is stealing, only China is stealing. Let me tell you something. The Japanese were the worst. And the Koreans and the Taiwan and the Hong Kong, we all stole from the West, just like from America, just like America stole from Europe. And so, such is the progression of human matters. It's not to condone it, but nonetheless, you have to recognize the facts. And so we should help China develop their own intellectual property, in which case they will be the interested party in order to protect it more. And that's exactly happening. And so why are people talking about it? Because the Trump administration, want to take every opportunity in this ideological fight with China and pick on every issue possible and begin to talk about it. And then everybody just chime in as if that is the truth without thinking independently. What the West gave to the world in the last 500 years that is really very precious is the independent thinking. So let us make sure that we keep that tradition in the West of independent thinking rather than just listening to the government and thoughtlessly accept that and follow them. And as a result, you are fooling yourself oftentimes.
Okay, very last question is about Tesla in China. So unlike General Motors or Volkswagen, Tesla is operating independently in China, and it looks like the sales in China are going to go through the roof. Is that the future for American firms that operate in China without JVs and sell directly into the Chinese market? Opportunity for lots of firms, or is Tesla unusual, if not unique?
Geoff, your question means, are the Chinese human? Are they human beings? Or are they from Mars? Are they superhuman, subhuman, or whatever, right? As long as, they are human, which they are, of course, then the progression of the Chinese economy will go exactly the same direction as everybody else. And Tesla is, it's selling a lot of cars. But on the other hand, there's a lot of Chinese companies, Xiaopeng and NIO and all that stuff, that are now rising in the mainland China as well. And so as long as politics does not interfere with business, and I fear that under Trump, it was interfering with business big time. So as long as you don't let politics, international politics, interfere in business and trade and investment, then China will have to open up its market gradually, like what they have done to Starbucks, like what they have done to Tesla. But if America were to do foolish things, then who knows what will the future hold. But if left to free trade, then I think that China will no doubt open up more and more. When the Chinese company like Xiaopeng or whoever begin to rise, right, Tesla has to be careful, because if it is truly a free market, then other people can do it too. And so over time, if Tesla were to no longer be the number one in the Chinese market, it may not be because of, I don't believe it will be because of protection. It will be because of market competition. It's a free market competition. So I think that, China is very, very happy to open its market over gradually to the rest of the world. My worry is not whether China's market is moving in the right direction. My worry is America moving in the wrong direction in stopping free trade and free investment. And, the last 4 years are just examples of that.
So, Ronnie, one thing I've learned in our remote world is we should start on time and end on time. My clock has just ticked over to the top of the hour. There are many topics we could dig more deeply into, but I'm afraid our time is up. On behalf of everybody who's joined this call, I want to thank you for your time, your wisdom, your openness. And I also want to thank everybody who's participated. The topics we've been discussing, I think there's nothing that could be more important. So thank you so much for everything you've done today, everything you do for USC, you've done throughout your life, everything you do for Trans-Pacific relations through the Asia Society. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Geoff. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you, Ronnie. Bye-bye.